The original inhabitants of Jamaica were the Arawak Indians, who settled there around 500 BC. In 1494, Columbus came across the island. The Spanish then invaded, killing and torturing all the inhabitants and claiming it as a colony of Spain. Fast forward 150 years, the British invaded Jamaica, defeated the Spanish, and claimed Jamaica as a colony of the British Empire. In 1662, Britain started shipping Africans to Jamaica, which started the slave trade triangle, which worked like this. Ships left the shore of Britain filled with trade goods heading for Africa, which were then exchanged for slaves which were brought to Jamaica and sold to plantation owners. These same ships were then loaded up with sugar and rum and molasses for the last leg back to Britain. The British Empire profited from the trading of the slaves and from the goods the slaves produced. This was the arrangement for the next 150 years, which would see millions of Africans traded across the Atlantic Ocean, earning the British Empire an estimated £4 trillion. From this huge financial gain, Britain was developing in many areas. Its infrastructure improved, the roads, bridges, canals and ports, as well as the health services, educational services, schools were built. Trade relationships were strengthened with other countries, and the British banking industry was ignited, amongst many, many, many other things. Then in 1808, after 150 years, multiple revolts in Jamaica and 20 years of campaigning in Britain, the slave trade was abolished, which meant the Brits were no longer allowed to ship Africans to Jamaica to be slaves. However, they were still allowed to keep slaves and profit from the goods that they produced. However, this was barely enforced or policed, so much of the trade still continued. In 1834, the Emancipation Act was passed, which kind of meant that slaves were free, except they had to work as apprentices under the ownership of their slave masters. 4 years later, they were actually freed. This meant a huge payout for the slave owners of £2 million, which in today's money is equivalent to anywhere from £2 billion to £17 billion. Yep, the slave owners got compensation for losing their slaves, but the slaves that were freed were only given their freedom. They had no compensation and no representation in the legislatures. After slavery, indentured labour was brought in from China and India. This resulted in more abuse and was not abolished until the early part of the 20th century. After indentured labour, Africans and Indians found it difficult to own land and build communities in Jamaica. It wasn't until 1962 that Jamaica gained its independence and British rule ended. Only then did Jamaica begin its own constitution, which sets out the laws by which the people are governed. Yes, years have passed and the people directly to blame have passed too. This doesn't mean that Britain and its people aren't still benefiting from the spoils of those centuries of abuse and forced labour. We must acknowledge that the very recent history Britain has had with Jamaica has shaped very directly the way Britain is today. Atrocious crimes against humanity have been committed. But having humanity now and compassion is the only way we'll work towards healing the past, lest we forget that we are in fact human.